There's a drawer in a museum somewhere with a tooth in it that will stop you mid-sentence. It is triangular, serrated along both edges, and larger than your palm. You pick it up expecting the weight of a keepsake, and instead feel something closer to a brick. For a moment, your brain simply refuses to process it, because nothing alive today grows teeth like that. That tooth belonged to Otodus Megalodon, and for 20 million years it belonged to the most efficient killer machine the ocean has ever produced. It is extinct. Every serious line of fossil evidence agrees on that. And yet in 1918, off a stretch of Australian coastline near the fishing town of Port Stephens, a group of hardened, unsentimental working men swore they watched something enormous rise out of deep, study them, and wreck a week of their livelihood without ever taking a bite. Tonight we're going back to that morning, piece by piece, to find out what can honestly be said about it, and what can't. Let's start with what Megalodon actually was, because the scale of the animal matters for everything that follows. Fossil remains for its length somewhere between 15 and 20 meters, with the largest individuals possibly nudging past that. Its bite, reconstructed from jaw models built around those fossil teeth, is the strongest bite force ever calculated for any animal in the history of the planet. Strong enough to shatter the ribcage of a whale. It hunted the warm, shallow coastal seas of the Miocene and Pliocene, the eras when the modern whale lineages were still working out their final shapes, and for the entire span of its reign nothing challenged it. Not one fossil site anywhere on Earth shows evidence of an animal that preyed on adult Megalodon. It was simply, unambiguously, the top of its world. And then it wasn't. Sometime around 3 to 3.5 million years ago, the fossil record of Megalodon teeth, which is abundant and widespread for the previous 20 million years, stops. Not thins out. Stops. That distinction matters enormously to anyone trying to argue the animal might have survived into the present. A shark's teeth are constantly shed and replaced throughout its life, which means a healthy, breeding population leaves an almost absurd quantity of physical evidence behind it, scattered across every seafloor it hunts. Megalodon left that evidence for 20 million consecutive years, and then, within a geological eye blink, left none at all. Ocean temperatures were dropping. The shallow nursery bays where juveniles likely grew up were shrinking as sea levels fell. Its primary prey, the great whales, were themselves changing and thinning in numbers. And a new competitor had arrived. Smaller, faster, more adaptable predators, ancestors of the modern great white and the earliest orcas, animals built for a colder, leaner ocean than the one Megalodon had been built for. An apex predator that depends on warm coastal shallows and abundant giant prey does not quietly relocate to the cold. Food poured deep and vanished there for 3 million years without a trace. It has nowhere left to go. So it ended the way every dominant species eventually ends when the world it was built for stops existing. That is the settled science. It's also, frankly, a little unsatisfying because it closes a door that popular imagination desperately wants left open. The ocean is enormous, largely unmapped, and genuinely still capable of surprising us. We have charted the surface of Mars in finer detail than we have charted our own ocean floor. Most of what lies below a few hundred meters has never been seen by a human eye, let alone photographed or cataloged. And the deep sea has, on occasion, actually delivered on that promise of hidden giants. The coelacanth, a fish known only from fossils and presumed extinct for roughly 65 million years, turned up very much alive in a South African fishing net in 1938, and the discovery upended an entire branch of paleontology overnight. The giant squid, for centuries dismissed as pure sailor's myth, was eventually confirmed real and then photographed alive in its own environment within living memory. So the instinct to believe the ocean might still be hiding something enormous is not a rational superstition. It is grounded in real precedent. The catch, and it's an important one, is that both of those animals are built for concealment. They are creatures of cold water, extreme depth and darkness, adapted specifically to a world that never sees sunlight. Megalodon was the opposite kind of animal entirely. A warm water, shallow coastal hunter that needed sunlit nurseries and abundant surface prey to survive. That is precisely the kind of animal the ocean cannot easily hide, which is part why the fossil silence after 3 million years ago carries so much weight. So when a story surfaces about fishermen encountering something impossibly large, something ancient and pale and far bigger than anything in the record books, it lands on genuinely fertile ground, shaped by real discoveries, even if this particular story doesn't fit the pattern those discoveries established. And no story has landed harder or lasted longer than what allegedly happened off Port Stephens. Picture the setting first, because it matters. New South Wales, 1918. The First World War is still grinding on in Europe, but out on this stretch of coast it barely registers. A headline in a paper that arrives days late, nothing more. Life here runs on an older, more immediate calendar. The tides, the weather, and the catch. The men who worked these waters were crayfishermen, professional lobster fishermen who set heavy baited pots along the seafloor and hauled them up loaded day after day, season after season. This was not casual work, and these were not casual men. Many had learned these particular grounds from their fathers, who had learned them from theirs. They knew which reefs held good ground and which shifted with the season, which channels ran cold, where the current would drag a pot line if you weren't careful. Sharks were part of that knowledge too, an ordinary, expected feature of the job, a nuisance you work around rather than something that kept you up at night. Fear, for men who made their living hauling gear off the bottom of the ocean before sunrise, was not really an affordable emotion. You could not run a business on caution alone, according to the accounts that have survived, and it's worth being upfront that what we have is oral history and second-hand written record, not a contemporary newspaper report or ship's log. A group of these crayfishermen were out working their pot lines on what began as an entirely unremarkable morning. The first thing that reportedly caught their attention wasn't size. It was color. Something pale, almost glowing, was visible rising to the darker water beneath the boats. Not the quick gray flash of a passing shark, but something that seemed to be rising with no urgency at all, as though it had nowhere else to be and nothing whatsoever to fear. As it came closer to the surface, and the men could make out more of its shape, the story goes that its sheer length became the detail that undid them. A shark, to an experienced eye, is something you take in almost instantly, head, dorsal fin, tail, a single recognizable silhouette. What the men described instead was something that kept going. As one end passed beneath one boat, they claimed, the other end had not yet cleared the far side of a second vessel some distance away. What happened next, according to the story, is the part that has kept it alive for over a century, because it isn't a story about an attack. It's a story about the absence of one, and the strange behavior that filled that absence instead. The animal did not strike. It did not flee. It reportedly circled the boat slowly, came back past him again, and in doing so damaged or destroyed a string of pot lines, heavy gear anchored to the seafloor with thick rope, gear that should have been far too substantial to simply disappear. Traps came up crushed. Others came up missing entirely, the lines severed cleanly somewhere below. To men whose entire trade depended on that gear surviving a season, this alone would have been alarming, but it was reportedly the manner of the animal that unsettled them most. Not aggression, but what can only be described as attention. It held position near the boats. It seemed, in the words later attributed to the men, to be studying them. Whatever actually happened out there, something clearly frightened this crew badly enough to change their behavior in a way that fear alone rarely manages. Reports say the fleet stayed tied up at the dock for the better part of a week afterward. Nets unused, pots stacked on the wharf, boats idle, while good fishing weather passed them by, and their households went without the income that week should have brought. That detail is, honestly, the strongest piece of circumstantial evidence in the entire story. People exaggerate sightings constantly. They rarely choose to go without pay for a week to avoid a shape they merely imagined. The reason this story survived at all, rather than dissolving into local folklore the way 10,000 other fishermen's tales have, is that it reached a naturalist named David Stead. Stead was not a credulous man looking for a headline. He was a serious student of Australian marine life, who spent much of his career among fishing communities, and he understood something a lot of armchair skeptics miss. People who spend their working lives on the water often notice things that scientists working from a desk never will. He listened to the crayfishermen's account, weighed the character of the men telling it, and concluded that whatever had happened, it was not the product of idle imagination or drink. These were sober, practical men whose livelihoods depended on reading the sea correctly. He recorded the account rather than dismissing it, and it's largely because a credentialed observer chose to take it seriously that the story survived into the 20th century with any credibility attached to it at all. Now, credibility is not the same as proof, and this is where an honest examination has to slow down and start pulling the story apart carefully, because the details that make it compelling are also the details that make it hardest to accept at face value. Start with the size estimates, because they are, frankly, the story's weakest point. Depending on which version you read, the animal was described as anywhere from roughly 35 meters long to, in the most exaggerated retellings, close to 90 meters, a length that would put it well beyond the largest blue whale ever recorded, the biggest animal known to have existed on Earth in any era. Numbers like that should immediately raise a flag, and not because the men were lying. Estimating size at sea is notoriously unreliable even for trained observers, because there is nothing out on open water to measure an object against, no buildings, no fence posts, no familiar scale. A large animal glimpsed through murky water, at an uncertain depth, by men who are frightened, will almost always be remembered as larger than it actually was. And that effect compounds over time. Every retelling, every year that passes, every time the story gets shared at the dock or handed down to the next generation, the number tends to creep upward, because a human memory of a genuinely frightening moment isn't a photograph. It's a living thing that keeps reshaping itself around the emotion attached to it. So the size figures in this story, even the most conservative ones, tell us more about how terrifying the encounter felt than about the actual dimensions of whatever was in the water. The color is a stranger problem, because it's consistent across every version of the account, and it doesn't have an obvious innocent explanation. Every retelling insists the animal was pale, not the dark slate gray of a typical shark's back, but ghostly, near luminous white, top to bottom. This matters because it cuts against the most obvious candidate for what the men actually saw. A great white shark is countershaded for a reason. Dark on top, so it's difficult to spot from above against the deep water. Pale underneath, so it's difficult to spot from below against a bright surface. A great white passing beneath a boat should loom as a dark shape, not glow white. So either the men were describing an animal that wasn't a great white at all, or they encountered an unusual individual. And unusual individuals do exist. Leucism, a genuine condition in which an animal's pigmentation is reduced or largely absent, has been documented in sharks. A large, pale-bellied shark affected by it, seen through churned-on water by men already gripped by fear, could very plausibly read as ghostly white rather than merely light-colored. It's not a satisfying answer if what you want is a surviving megalodon, but it is a considerably more defensible one. The behavior, too, sounds less otherworldly once you set aside the framing of the story and look at what large sharks are actually known to do. Big, curious sharks, great whites among them, do sometimes linger around a boat, circle it repeatedly, bump or investigate unfamiliar objects in their territory rather than simply passing through. To men who had never experienced that kind of prolonged, deliberate attention from an animal before, a few minutes of circling could easily have felt like being studied, even calculated. Fear compresses and distorts time as thoroughly as it distorts size. None of this requires a monster. It only requires an unusually large, unusually pale individual of a species the men already knew, encountered under exactly the conditions most likely to make an ordinary predator feel supernatural. So where does that actually leave us? Somewhere frustratingly, honestly in the middle. There is no photograph. There is no recovered tooth from that encounter, no body, no physical evidence of any kind. Only an account, taken seriously by one credible naturalist, passed down for over 100 years by people who clearly believed something genuinely frightening happened to their ancestors on that water. The evidence does not prove a surviving megalodon was involved. The complete absence of megalodon teeth anywhere in the fossil record for the past 3 million years, despite how prolifically the species shed and replaced them for the 20 million years before that, makes a surviving population almost impossible to reconcile with what we know of how the fossil record actually works. But the evidence doesn't fully explain the story away either. It doesn't erase the fact that a full working fleet of professional watermen, men whose entire economic survival depended on going out on that water, chose instead to stay ashore for the better part of a week rather than risk another encounter. Maybe what those men saw that morning was an unusually large great white, pale from a pigment condition, moving with more curiosity than the men had ever witnessed from a shark before, magnified by fear and distance, and particular helplessness of standing on a small wooden boat over deep, dark water. That is very likely the honest answer. It is not the answer that makes it the best campfire story, and it is certainly not the answer the century of retellings have wanted. But it does not make what happened any less real to the men who lived it, and it does not make Megalodon any less staggering as an animal simply because it is gone. 20 million years at the absolute top of every ocean it swam in is not a small thing. It doesn't need to still be alive to matter. It's worth remembering, too, that we still don't fully know what Megalodon looked like, or exactly how large the biggest individuals grew, because we have never once found complete skeleton of one. Shark skeletons are built from cartilage rather than bone, and cartilage rarely survives the fossilization process. It breaks down long before it can turn to stone. Almost everything we know about Megalodon comes from teeth and occasional fragment of vertebra, which means every reconstruction of the animal's full body, every size estimate you've ever seen in a documentary or museum diagram, is an informed extrapolation rather than a direct measurement. That is a genuinely open scientific mystery, and is a far more interesting one than the question of whether a lone survivor was circling a lobster boat off the New South Wales coast in 1918. The real unknowns here belong to paleontology, not to cryptozoology, and there is something almost more satisfying in that, because it means the mystery is one science can still eventually resolve. What the Port Stephen story actually preserves, in the end, may not be evidence of surviving prehistoric predator at all. It may simply be a near-perfect record of what genuine, professional, unshakable fear looks like when it meets something the mind has no ready category for, and a reminder just how much of the ocean around us we still don't fully understand, even now, even with everything we know. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you had been standing on that deck at dawn in 1918, watching something pale and enormous rise slowly out of the dark beneath your boat, do you think you have quietly told yourself it was an unusual great white? Or do you think, in that moment, some older and less rational part of